Hello, I'm Anthony. Welcome back to the Arturia CMI-V tutorial series. I'm going to be doing another preset deep dive today. Just before we kick off, if I can point you at the Patreon link in the description below, or alternatively the YouTube channel member join button, they're great ways to help support me and my channel. So this is the CompuRhythm preset, and this is what it sounds like. Now, even though we've got 7 slots filled for this sound, there's nothing fundamentally difficult. What we're really talking about today is how to organize our thinking and deconstruction process when we've got lots of different sounds potentially competing with each other. Now, the simplest thing to do is to go through them one at a time. If I solo each individual sound, then we're just going to hear that on its own. The one thing to bear in mind, as I've mentioned previously in this tutorial, if you solo sounds, you won't hear any sound on the auxiliary bus. But as it happens, we've got a reverb on the auxiliary bus, and every one of the slots is turned down to minimum. So we're not actually hearing this reverb. We don't need to worry about that. It should also be pretty obvious that we're dealing with a sequence sound here. So let's jump over to the sequence tab. And this is what you get right out of the box. And something immediately jumps up at me. Why are we listening to pattern number 4? Well, we'll get there shortly, but let's just take things one at a time. Nice simple kick sound. So if I hold that key down, we have a look at the sound, you can see that the sample's playing. And at this point, we want to find out whether or not there are any effects applied to that sound. Now, we're dealing with 7 slots here. And the way we figure out whether or not there are any assignments on the modulation page is by scrolling across these map buttons and kind of hovering over them and seeing what we see. Well, because there are 7 different slots, I don't want to have to do that every time. So I wrote myself this little 2-minute thing in Word, which is basically just a pro format. I can save this. The modulation entries down the left-hand side are always the same. They're your standard modulation sources. And across the top, I can just insert the destinations. And so in a matter of a couple of minutes, I can make a very quick chart of which modulation controls are being assigned to which sound. And then I can keep referring back to this as I'm deconstructing the sound. I don't need to constantly keep hovering over stuff to figure out what's going on. Now, the long and short of it is that with the exception of the 2 slots in the bottom row, we'll deal with them last. Each of these 5 drum sounds doesn't have anything in the controls, functions and switches section, but it does have stuff mapped on the MIDI page. So curiously we've got velocity mapping, and I say curiously because the sequencer itself controls the volume of the sounds that are played. So it doesn't particularly matter how hard we hit a key, the volumes are mapped here. Then we've got modulation wheel controlling the filter settings for each of the 7 sounds. So as I jump across each of these, you can see they're all mapped to filter in varying amounts. And so there's my mod wheel turned all the way down. There's it dulling. While I'm doing that, I'll just pull the solo out so we can hear the modulation wheel operating on all 7 sounds simultaneously. Because it's applying filter to all of them, let's hear the composite effect of that. Modulation wheel all the way up. Here's me pulling the modulation wheel down. Now, that's not the end of the story with filtering. There is another modulation source tied into the filter, but not on the kick drum, so we're not going to worry about it for now. Head back into solo again so that we know what we're doing. We've got expression. Now, I've not mapped any expression modulation source to this sound, but this is your CC11 value, and they're all mapped to vibrato. So if you want to control vibrato, you'll do it externally from our controller via that method. And this is the sustain pedal. And again, the sustain pedal is tied to your damping. So if you had a sustain pedal connected to your keyboard, then by opening up these damping levels, basically increasing the decay of the sound, that's what gives you your extended release. Now, the story is absolutely identical for the next 4 slots, so we really don't need to belabor this point. Here's the snare sound. And you can see just playing the sample. Here's the stick. Hi-hats. And ride. And so there's just the drum kit on its own. Let's have a look at the mapping in the sequencer. There's some interesting stuff going on over here. Even though they're drum sounds, they're tuned. Everything in the CMI is tuned. It has no idea that it's playing a drum kit. It's just a note assigned to a particular key. And so you can see on the sticks line over here at the end, we've got some tonal variation. That's really cool. But we've also got this suspicious pattern 4 thing going on here. I want to know what's going on in the previous 3 patterns. Well, it turns out they're all populated. We have 4 completely different patterns here. And this is the kind of stuff that's just really easy to miss. You know, always allow your curiosity to say, hang on a minute, why is preset 4, pattern 4 pre-selected? And then you find you've got basically 3 brand new patterns to play with. So if you wanted to build a sequence inside the sequencer, you could do it by connecting these things together and setting your various reset values. You could drag each one of these out into your DAW and control it there. There's all sorts of different ways that you can manipulate your patterns. You could just do it manually by selecting the various patterns, but that's a bit clunky. Let's have a look over in the mixer, what controls we've got over there for our drum kit. So from this point, having identified each of the different drum sounds, I've listened to it in isolation, I've had a look at the sampler, I've verified that there are no modulation values beyond that simple filter on the modulation wheel that I need to be worried about. So I can now start treating that as a composite kit. The fact that it's coming from 5 different sources is irrelevant. Got a phaser assigned to stick 2. There it is dry. Don't mistake that those tonal notes at the end for the phased sound. It can fool the ear quite easily. But the phaser is obviously heavily accentuating that, and those notes at the end now really, you really hear that effect kicking in hard. Let's have a listen to the 2 tonal sounds. Let's start with synth-based 3 first. This is a sample. And you can see that even though the sample length is set to maximum, it's only playing short lengths of it. And again, the different patterns, that one's actually a static C3. Let's see if we've got any other tonal variation in any of the other patterns. Yeah, this one. Now, when I did my modulation mapping document earlier, I made a note that synth-bass was connected to C1. We'll just bear this in mind so I don't have to bring it back again. Spectral is tied to C2 and 3. Come to that later. And so let's see what C1 is doing. Okay, that's also mapped to the filter. Now this is where you need to be aware of the summing effect of modulation values. So currently the modulation wheel is all the way down. If I pull the modulation wheel all the way up, you can see there's the negative modulation being applied. Verify that our modulation on the wheel is negative, minus 41%. But on the C1 controller, it's a positive filter effect. So those 2 things are directly competing with each other. The only way you're ever actually going to get up to full filter, in other words, a maximum filter setting, is if the modulation wheel is set to allow that to happen. Now I've pre-mapped my quick controls to C1, 2 and 3. You can see in my quick control section over here. So I can turn my knob on the keyboard. Let's get that going. So that's fully damp. So that's as low, that's both modulations set as low as they can be. Knobs turned all the way down, modulation wheels turned all the way up, because that's an inverted effect. That's as flat as it's going to get. Now pull the wheel back. There's half of the job done, but the controller knob allows me to introduce the rest of the modulation. Now you might ask yourself why you would have two directly competing modulation effects like that. It's because the other 6 sounds are also tied into the filter. So if we undo the solo and get the entire sound going. So there's my modulation wheel affecting the whole sound. But my quick controller is just controlling the synth bass. Now, while I was doing that, I thought I can't leave it any longer without dealing with this delay issue in the mixer. It's actually on the next sound, the spectral synth. So we're pretty much done with the synth bass at this point. We need to jump over to this spectral synth sound. There's an odd thing in this preset. The sequence is synced, but the delay on this spectral synth sound isn't, and it just sounds out to my ears. I'm not altogether sure why they've done it, but you can see that the timing is set to 291 milliseconds. So it entirely depends what the tempo of your host DAW is, whether or not these things are going to align, and it's a pretty intense delay effect, and it just sounds out to me. So what I ended up doing was turning the sync on and basically salting to taste. I chose 1/8 triplet. Now I'll press a key and let's listen to it for a second. It still sounds a bit wrong to my ears, and the reason I concluded that that was the case is because the wet dry is more than 50%. In other words, the delay sounds are louder than the original key press. I found that when I pulled the delay effect down to below 50%, it just sounded better to my ears. Now that's obviously entirely up to you whether you're happy with that kind of asynchronous thing that's going on with the delay, but I think that's improved the preset. And it's just that kind of stuff, tuning your ears into the various aspects of the sound and being aware that you need to view all of this stuff holistically. We also saw earlier that the spectral synth sound has 2 modulation controls on C1 and C2 and C3. So let's deal with each of those. So C2 is also a filter mapping. Similar kind of thing to the synth bass. When all the drums are going in one direction, you can have the lead sounds going in the other. But this is an interesting one. C3 is mapped to the semitone control of the tuner. What that basically means is as you turn C3, you're going to change the pitch of the played sequence. So let's solo it. So there's no modulation applied there. As I begin to turn up C3, and that's all very well and good for kind of having fun, but when the rest of the sequence is playing in the background, it's going to be a little bit disjointed if one of the sounds is going all over the place with a very heavily pitched sequence and nothing else is. I'll demonstrate that just flat before I suggest a possible solution. See, as you turn in the knob, all of those individual notes as they're playing and being having their pitch affected sounds a bit weird. Again, it might be an effect that you want, it's completely fine. But what I decided to do was create myself an automation track. Now this is very easy in Cubase. You basically just turn right automation on, press play, and turn the knob and it will create the automation track for you. I just worked it out empirically. The value is 0.4 and it translates into a major third. If I position, wherever I position the song marker, it's going to automatically pick up that level of automation. So here we are at 0, have a look at the tuner. It's playing an A, and over in the second section, playing a D flat. So it's basically increasing by 4 semitones, and now that that's really nice and sharp and happening at exactly the end of the fourth bar, then we should now bring the rest of the sequence in, which hasn't been pitched. Everything else is playing at the same pitch all of the time. Here we go. So that's the way, if you want to use the pitch modulation built into the preset, rather than, you can do all of this stuff in your DAW, of course you can. But we've been given this controller to play with, so I thought I'd play with it. Final thing to mention, just to wrap it up, this spectral synth is a spectral synth. No surprises there. There's no modulation being applied to it, so it's purely just using the additive engine rather than a sample to generate its sound. Little bit of tasteful panning and level control in the mix to make sure everything else hangs together. And that's the preset built. Hope you enjoyed the episode. If you did, please hit the like button. I'll see you for the next one. Thanks a lot.